George Floyd was a man who died in Minneapolis after a police officer placed a knee on top of Mr. Floyd's head for an extended period of time. The 4 officers involved are now in custody. One of them was charged with second-degree murder, and the other 3 were charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder. In the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's death, a wave of protests erupted across the country demanding justice for George Floyd and an end to police violence. At the time of recording, the protests have been continuing and have gone on for around 13 days. Now, while the protests and demonstrations have been intense, I am unconvinced that it will produce the change that we desperately need within our communities that will address the roots of police violence and the carceral state. This is compounded by tendencies within contemporary left liberal activists that are detrimental to building the political counterbalance necessary to achieve fundamental change. Now, one might wonder, why at this moment of uncertainty and tumult have I not talked about the need for solidarity and aggressive posturing against police violence? To be clear, I am in full support of the protests and am abhorred by the reprehensible killing of George Floyd, as well as the wanton use of force against peaceful demonstrators by highly militarized police throughout the country. My objective here is not to diminish or detract from the efforts of activists, protesters, and anyone who is involved in the fight against racism and police violence. I'm not here to promote some form of hashtag All Lives Matters BS rhetoric that is espoused by conservatives and reactionaries. My goal here is to provide a nuanced and critical assessment on the current situation, along with a critique of the ideas and thinking propounded by contemporary activists and BLM-aligned supporters, utilizing research from several prominent scholars. I will also be adding my own takes and opinions regarding the matter. I noticed 2 distinct groups emerging during the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's death. The first one focuses solely on the looting and violence to undermine, obfuscate, and detract from the overall message of justice for George Floyd, and the sense of anger and frustration. This is nothing new. In every instance of protest regarding police violence, this camp always emerges. For the people on the left, and those more politically attuned, it is obvious that this view is propagated to diminish the message, momentum, and unity of those involved in the protest or may have a modest interest in the affair. Now, this includes discussions on who the looters are versus the protesters, or whether there were outside agitators, etc., etc. We know this view is unconducive for advancing the mission towards ending police brutality and racism. As Professor Cornel West mentioned during his CNN and Fox News interviews at the end of May, we'll be retreading the same conversational topics if the topic of discussion is peaceful versus non-peaceful demonstrators and looters versus legitimate forms of political expression. It's something that is talked about on every news cycle whenever an incident like this occurs, and it's a pretty obvious ploy to slow the momentum of any popular movement and turn public opinion against it. Not only is it a distraction, but it assumes that the people demonstrating, protesting, and committing crimes are a unified force under some sort of unitary leadership or supervision. People will always take advantage of the situation to serve their own agenda, with vandalism and looting being one of them. For those that are concerned with egalitarian outcomes and justice, a discussion on organizational strategy and how to expand the base would be more helpful and productive. Now, there's also a second and more curious or complex camp that emerged during the protests. This group of individuals, generally more politically attuned to social issues than the first camp, are unquestioningly supportive of ending police violence and tackling racism, sexism, misogyny, and the like. They are supportive of the protests and may even be uncritically supportive of the rioting and chaos. Now, this group makes heavy use of sloganeering and posturing to get their point across. Unfortunately, they discount the necessity of coalition building and alliance formulation as a strategy to tackle police violence beyond the sporadic but intense displays of anger and frustration. This is mainly due to the faulty race reductionist and morally righteous posturing and unhelpful usage of privilege and oppression Olympics. While the uprisings across the United States give us hope that a large segment of the population will not stand idly while police routinely and ruthlessly exhibit violence against minorities and the helpless, I remain unconvinced that a class-oriented movement will surface unless we abandon identitarian forms of ideology. Left liberals have utilized language and social media to promote a divisive form of identity politics that poses a binary, if you're not for Black Lives Matter, you're for white supremacy kind of framing. Now, this is supported by the common usage of the term privilege and allyship to suggest one's commitment to the fight for justice. Now, according to Professor Cedric Johnson, this kind of thinking is unproductive and unhelpful in really thinking strategically and earnestly about political tactics and organization. Quote, contemporary white self-flagellation over being a good ally is clearly descended from the expulsion of whites from civil rights organizations discussed previously, and it inherits all of the moment's problems as political practice, imposing a social hierarchy on political life based on identity claims rather than demonstrated commitment, political acumen, organizing skills, and capacity, or other criteria that should matter, end quote, says Professor Johnson. Like I mentioned in my previous podcast, when whiteness equals privilege, indifference, aloofness to racism, wealth, and so on, and while blackness equals noble, long-suffering victims, wisdom, courage, this leads to terrible and misguided discussions on social media regarding white guilt and the need to listen to black voices and black leadership. This privilege framework suggests that whites and other privileged groups must repent for their sins through performances of self-flagellation and atonement before they can take part in the political struggle, and then only in a limited capacity as allies. This kind of thinking is wholly unfit in terms of building a serious political movement. It focuses on interpersonal relations and group dynamics, rather than a deep analysis on the conditions and processes that have enabled inequality, racism, and injustice. Now, some individuals are engaging the outright worst forms of identity politics and the usage of the privilege concept I've ever seen. Now, for example, a common stance held by activists is that rioting and collateral damage are necessary or a natural outgrowth of decades of malaise, inequality, and injustice. I, for one, share a similar view. Given the lack of organizational strength on the left and the absence of any central committee that has the political influence and relationships to direct the massive protesters towards strategic ends, combined with frustration, hopelessness, and anger at the political establishment and material conditions, one can expect property damage and violence as an expression. However, elements of the contemporary liberal left and other activists have criticized looting when committed by whites and ignored or downplayed the chaos if it was committed by people of color, even as videos from scenes of the protests have clearly shown that these acts are perpetrated by people of all colors and sexes. Not only does this thinking utilize the most blatant form of exceptionalism and deference to identity as the basis for action, the sectarian division among who gets to perform what action is divisive, moronic, and territorial. A fundamental part of BLM-aligned supporters and activists is liberal antiracism. To be sure, we should fight and combat racism. However, the liberal anti-racist frame often reduces issues of inequality and injustice into matters of racial disparity and race reductionism. This falls comfortably into the concept of social justice within the confines of neoliberal capitalism. This kind of thinking is unconcerned with the type of outcome or the intensity of negative outcomes, but rather, if the outcomes affect identity groups in a proportionate way. Let's take a look into the data to see who is most routinely policed, incarcerated, and killed by police. By doing so, we can formulate the appropriate strategy to roll back the carceral state and the criminal justice crisis. Now, research demonstrates that the dominant anti-racist discourse surrounding contemporary issues of police violence are inadequate. To no one's surprise, blacks are killed at a disproportionate rate by police. They represent 24% of all police shootings, yet blacks are only around 13% of the population. They're also 3 times more likely to be killed by police than whites, and that's according to mappingpoliceviolence.org. However, whites make up the majority of those killed by police. According to Statista, from 2017 to March 2020, a staggering 3,215 people were killed by police. 1,268 of those killed were white, 698 black, 498 Latino, 122 other, and 629 unknown. Data from The Guardian indicates that 1,093 people were killed by police in 2016, with 574 being white, 266 black, along with 183 Latino or Hispanic. What I'm trying to say here is, or rather what I'm not trying to say here, is again another form of I don't see race or all lives matter type crap. What I am suggesting is that the racial disparity line commonly espoused by activists and left liberals leaves us a bit short. In order to formulate the broad coalition needed to fight against police violence at the local, state, and national level, we need to utilize a different framework, one that organizes all victims in the campaign against the use of force and towards democratic oversight. The racial disparity and liberal anti-racist line is too narrow and assumes that the other victims of police violence either got what was coming to them or deserved their fate. It's not enough to eliminate just the disparities, but to eliminate the negative outcomes altogether. Only by organizing the mass of victims affected by a certain issue will we have the numbers capable of mounting a counterattack against the roots of the disparity. A closer look at criminal justice data reveals a clear-cut class element in those that are arrested, killed, and institutionalized. According to Professor Floyd, and I think I'm butchering his name, class is the first and foremost variable on who gets arrested and incarcerated. Many of those are poor, do not hold steady or full-time work, dependent on welfare, lack education, come from single-parent households, disabled, homeless, or have a history of mental health and substance abuse issues. Moreover, changes in prison population during the past several decades can be attributed to the incarceration of primarily lower-class blacks. Data from the period of 1979 to 1999 shows the cumulative risk of imprisonment for blacks without a high school degree tripling to 59%, while at the same time, the same rate fell from 6% to 5% for blacks with some college education. Most importantly, Vaquant found that the class disproportionality inside each ethnic group category is greater than the racial disproportionality between them. Journalist Zaid Jilani's research into police killings in 2015 also revealed a class-based element to who is killed. 95% of police killings occurred in neighborhoods where the median family income was under $100,000. The average neighborhood family income where a killing occurred was $57,764. The median family income was $52,907. Because family household income of $100,000 or more puts you in the top 21% of American income earners, according to Jelani, this means that the incomes below this number are overrepresented by 4 times compared to the income distribution and how often they are killed by police. Further proof of the class character in crime and punishment can be found by the recent piece in Catalyst Journal by Professors John Clegg and Adonir Usmani. Over the past decades, the disparity between the incarceration of the rich and poor have skyrocketed. The incarceration rate among those with less than a high school education has dramatically increased, while the incarceration rate amongst college graduates, black and white, has declined. In 2017, a white high school dropout was about 15 times more likely to be in prison than a black college graduate, and a black college graduate going to prison halved these last several decades. Now, it should be clear that the anti-racist, race reductionist framework utilized by today's left liberals and activists is insufficient. It does not capture the full picture of who is policed and incarcerated in the United States. Famed political scientist and retired Professor Emeritus Adolph Reed Jr. noted the shortcomings of the liberal anti-racist line in providing a sufficient explanation of the processes and conditions that came together to produce the disparities and criminal justice issues we are facing today. Rather, the anti-racist framework serves only to describe the negative outcomes people experience as motivated by racism and discrimination. Reed describes this mode of thinking as, quote, "they're at best shorthand characterizations of more complex, or at least discrete actions taken by people in social contexts. At worst, and alas, more often in our political moment, they're invoked as alternatives to explanation," end quote. More broadly, historian Toure Reed makes a fantastic and detailed case regarding the separation of race from class and matters of political economy, and its effects throughout the 1930s to the present throughout his writings, particularly in Why Liberals Separate Race from Class and his book Towards Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism. He provides a convincing materialist history of the prevailing conditions, tendencies, and forces surrounding the abstraction of race from political economy. He contends that contemporary activists often see issues like inequality or police violence solely through the lens of race, which is problematic because it obscures the complex processes of political economy on the material well-being of poor and working people, especially blacks. With regards to the race reductionist framework, Toure Reed states in his article, Why Liberals Separate Race from Class, that, quote, "this is not just wrong, but the formulation, which ultimately treats race as unchanging and permanent rather than a product of specific historical and political economic relations, undermines both the cause of racial equality in general and pursuit of equitable treatment in the criminal justice system in particular," end quote. Toure then identifies New Deal-era politics as processes that helped and expanded the material well-being of blacks, although it certainly did not help as much as it did for whites, and racism and discrimination played much into this. But blacks did benefit in many ways. Veteran organizers A. Philip Randolph and Baird Rustin argued that the disparities in wealth and employment experienced by blacks were not solely caused by discrimination, but by changes in the economy, notably automation and deindustrialization, and that anti-discrimination measures along with economic policies were needed to right the ship. This culminated in the 1966 Freedom Budget for All, which detailed plans for full employment, a living wage, and public works programs. Unfortunately, the failure of the War on Poverty to tackle black inequality was due to the liberal tendency to abstract race from political economy and instead focusing on cultural tutelage, job training, and soft skills. Toure argues that the tendency to divorce race from political economy, especially after 1970, along with the prevalence of culture of poverty ideology, the destruction of the welfare state, and the rise of neoliberalism, eventually culminated in Bill Clinton's destruction of welfare, public housing, the signing of NAFTA and the Crime Act, all which negatively impacted the black poor and working class. Toure juxtaposes this narrative to the Bernie Sanders campaign, which galvanized millions of people in supporting a return to the public good framework of governance and of social democratic policies that would no doubt help people, especially poor blacks. How should we look at solutions to our present predicament regarding race, racism, discrimination, and criminal justice with an eye towards the reconnection of race back to political economy? Professors Usmani, Clegg, and Vaquant all acknowledge the benefits of technical solutions like restorative justice, shorter sentences, diversion programs, bail reform, etc. However, they note that criminal justice reform must go beyond these proposals to tackle the material roots of the hyper-incarcerated. In this case, the Usmani and Clegg piece perfectly complement Vaquant's work. Strong social spending must be utilized to improve schools, provide housing, implement public works programs, and deliver social services. However, we cannot achieve such political programs without significant redistributive measures from rich to poor. With the defeat of the social democratic tendencies of the civil rights movement, the divorce of race from class, anti-communism, and the kneecapping of militant labor, the poor and working class failed to create a strong counterbalance to win full redistributive measures from the elites and the rich. As a result, the development of the American carceral empire, according to Usmani and Clegg, is a symptom of the underdevelopment of the American welfare state and its social policies. Therefore, the task at hand is to build the class forces necessary to challenge wealth and power, to extract concessions, and facilitate the transfer of wealth and resources from top to bottom. On a slightly more lighter note, I'm already witnessing the most pitiful and dreadful displays of solidarity and allyship that actually functions as social justice within the confines of neoliberal capitalism. Already, we are hearing the calls to support Black leadership and Black businesses. Supporting Black business is actually a very conservative notion of assistance. It reproduces capitalist relations of distribution and consumption while benefiting a small minority. Ironically, the policing and carceral crisis can be linked to the inability of American capitalism to deliver a degree of material sustenance to the people most highly policed, killed, and institutionalized. You can't capitalism out of a problem that was created or strongly influenced by the deficiencies of capitalism. Not only that, business owners tend to be against wage increases, higher taxes, environmental regulations, labor laws, and unions, things that would no doubt improve the lives of working class people. In a strange combination of sectarian, anti-racism, and bourgeois ideology, I was perusing the Black Lives Matter Sacramento page, and there was a slogan that read something along the lines of, quote, "Do not profit off the suffering of Black people," end quote. Now, literally one post above that was an ad about selling a Black Lives Matters t-shirt. So it's not about whether people get to benefit or profit off of people's pain, but who gets to do it. Just thought you might enjoy that little story. Furthermore, loud and bombastic calls for support of Black leadership and Black voices generally end up elevating the PMC and the integration of minorities into the elite and upper crust. It's not that I'm against people achieving their dreams or attaining a well-paying job or doing well, but we have to go beyond symbolic displays of diversity and representation and elevate the masses of poor and working people rather than just having a small minority of people benefit. Now, this kind of thinking strongly mirrors the black faces in high places concept that Cornel West lambasted in a 2017 JSTOR interview. He stated that, quote, "We lost sight of attacking issues of poverty, class, with the death of Martin, and moved into obsession with having black faces in high places. As long as we had those black faces in high places, the poor could live symbolically through them, vicariously through them. Or those black faces themselves, middle class and upper middle class, could claim that somehow they were the index of progress. Whereas the real index of progress is ensuring that when you're living in poverty, you have a quality education for everybody, not ensuring that you have kids at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton." End quote. The irony of the calls to support black leadership and black voices is that Black Lives Matter emerged during the Obama presidency and during an era of unprecedented black leadership in cities, state senate seats, integrated police forces, and so on. Hence why I scoff at demands to vote out the bad actors in government. Lastly, as I've said in my episode, Subtle Asians, Race Reductionism, listening to XYZ voices or deferring to some form of identitarian leadership reduces that social group to a monolith with a unitary set of values, beliefs, and conflates identity with political constituency. We are no closer now at tackling the carceral state and ending police violence than when we were at in 2012/2013 when Black Lives Matters first formed. Liberal anti-racists and race reductionists may say that this is due to the persistence and strength of white supremacy in our country, but a deeper and more mature look at the situation reveals that this isn't the case. there's no doubt that I'll be attacked as insensitive, a class reductionist, or even a racist after this episode is published. I can already hear the footsteps in the distance. For anyone who wants to play the character assassination game, I implore you to look into the works that I have used in this piece, notably those by Adolph Reed Jr. and Cedric Johnson, and if you really want to play the identity game, well, they're both black and from the South. The Justice for George Floyd protests happening around the country are on a scale not seen since the 2008 Occupy protests. Millions marched on the streets, revolted by the barbaric killing of George Floyd. Ironically, the demonstrations against police killing elicited the most brutish, savage, and illegal use of police force, with police wantonly attacking peaceful marchers, demonstrators, and media personnel. Protesters continued to demonstrate and denounced racism and police use of force, shouting, "Black Lives Matters," "Justice for George Floyd," "Justice for Breonna Taylor," "Say their name," "No justice, no peace." Such emotive sloganeering draws attention towards the issue of racism and police use of force against black and brown people. However, the anti-racist framework is limited in its ability to capture who is most routinely policed and killed in the United States and the dynamics, complexities, and historical conditions that congealed to create our criminal justice crisis. We need to discard race reductionist frameworks and realize the limits of liberal anti-racism. What is needed more than ever are solutions that go beyond technical fixes in policing and incarceration and directly attack the material conditions that produce poverty, inequality, and injustice. In order to do that, we need to build a majoritarian left composed of broad coalitions and strong alliances, a movement that can identify who has power, how to challenge power, and eventually take power.